Chapter 9. Some particulars respecting Miss Brotherton. A demonstration of neighborly friendship and anxiety. The wilfulness of an heiress. A gleam of light caught in the darkness. The mansion of Miss Brotherton, at the distance of 3 miles from the town of Ashley, though less splendid in external appearance than that of Sir Matthew Dowling, was quite as elaborately elegant in its interior, and moreover incomparably superior to it in every point in which taste was concerned. To this superb home we must now follow the young heiress, as circumstance will hereafter frequently blend her name with that of Michael Armstrong. The position of Mary Brotherton was a very singular one, and in many respects far from being fortunate. At the age of 21 years and 8 months, she found herself, by the death of her mother, in the uncontrolled possession of £200,000. Her father, dead some 6 or 7 years before, had been a manufacturer of the old apprentice system school, and his fortune, made long before the humane bill of Sir Robert Peel the elder, had, in some degree, weakened the chains which bound thousands of friendless orphans to unmeasured and unmitigated drudgery. It was not till after the first number of this work was printed that the author learnt that the name of Brotherton existed among the capitalists of Lancashire. But when in that county, she heard it mentioned with great esteem. But of all the circumstances, his daughter was totally and altogether ignorant. Educated from a very early age at a fashionable London boarding school, she knew nothing concerning the neighbourhood of her home, but that its hills and valleys were deformed by tall chimneys and dirt smoke, and that none of the young ladies who paid her visits during the holidays were at all like her schoolfellows in London. Of course, the little lady soon learned to know that she was a person of great consequence at the age of 14, and had most completely acquired all the airs and graces of a spoiled child. But the death of her father was a great advantage to her. As his only child, and the only heir to his immense wealth, he rather worshipped than loved her, and the attention he paid her seemed more like acts of homage than of affection. Had she not given herself airs, he would have been miserable, and had it been possible that any act of hers could bring upon her a reprimand, it would have been something indicating her belief that she was formed of the same materials as the wretches who toiled for him. Fortunately, however, she was fond of her mother, who, being a great invalid, lived quietly in the midst of her splendor, and the holidays of her daughter would thus pass quietly too, which saved her from much early adulation. She had remained at school till nearly 18, and from that time to the period of her mother's death, which happened about 15 months before the opening of this narrative, she had led a life of great retirement, dividing her time between attendance in her sick mother's chamber, galloping about the country on horseback, and reading every book she could get hold of, good, bad, and indifferent. On first finding herself alone in her own great house, the poor girl wept bitterly. Her mother's increasing sufferings had long made her release from them an event to be ardently desired by the only being who loved her. But when it came at last, and she had herself to think of, and nobody else, there was something almost terrible in her utter loneliness. She was personally acquainted with very few in the neighborhood, and felt no affection for any of them. Of relations, to the best of her knowledge and belief, she possessed not one in the world, and with all her advantages, for she had many, being young, pretty, talented, and rich, she would gladly have changed places during the first week of her dismal mourning with any girl of her own age who had father, mother, brother, and sisters to love, and to be loved by. Mrs. Gabberley was the nearest neighbour she had on one side, and Lady Clarissa Shrimpton on the other, and both these ladies had occasionally been admitted to see her mother till within the few days of her death. When, therefore, this long-expected event at length took place, they both thought themselves privileged to assume the freedom of intimate friends, and penetrate to the lone boudoir of the mournful heiress. Fortunately for her it was that they did so, for though neither of them possessed any single quality of sufficient value to win and wear the esteem, or even the liking, of an acute, clear-sighted observer, such as the half-spoiled heiress certainly was, It was better to hear the sound of almost any human voice uttering words of kindness than to sit lonely and apart and hear none, so that neither the twaddling larum of Miss Gabberly nor the absurd affectation of Lady Clarissa were without their use. It might, however, have been somewhat dangerous to the moral development of the young lady's character, had she long continued to find her only relief from sorrow and solitude in the society of persons who could only amuse her by their absurdities. Almost the first time she exerted herself for the purpose of pursuing some of her ordinary occupations, she drew forth her drawing box, and produced a caricature of Lady Clarissa, reciting verses from the pen of Mr. Norville, and the first observations she committed to paper were the results of a tolerably accurate counting of the number of times Mrs. Gabberly had uttered, "Well now," during her last visit. At length, the first dismal fortnight being over, Miss Brotherton appeared at church, and then the whole neighbourhood rushed in to express their sympathy, till her very soul sickened under the cuckoo note of sorrowless lamentation. Nevertheless, there was so much of real sadness in the spectacle of a young girl thus left utterly alone in the world, that despite the golden light her wealth threw around her, many among her herd of visitors might have felt more for her, perhaps, than she gave them credit for. But unfortunately such persons are not those who make their griefs and clamour roar most audibly, so she knew nothing about it, if it were so, and therefore thereby lost any advantage which her temper might have gained from emotions that soothe and soften. Instead of this, she had to undergo what she felt to be a very severe persecution from the prodigious active interest which Miss Gabberly took in her and her concerns, as some of the singularities of Miss Brotherton's character will eventually produce results of considerable importance to our hero. It may not be amiss to recount the particulars of a scene which took place in her boudoir exactly 3 weeks after the death of her mother. On the morning in question, Miss Gabberly had as usual, made her way unannounced to the young lady's presence, by dint of that assumption of extreme intimacy in her manner of inquiring for her, which in this case, as in multitude of others, succeeded in putting to rout the protecting discretion of her servants. "Well now, dear child," she exclaimed upon entering, "how are you to-day? Upon my word, Mary, you are too pale. You know, my dear, the pallor, as we call it, is not natural to your complexion, and therefore the symptoms must be attended to. Have you any camphor in the house, dear?" "Thank you, Miss Gabberly, but I want nothing of the kind." "Well now, then I must think of something else." "Not for me, ma'am. I shall not take any medicine whatever." "Dear child, how very odd that does seem to me. We people of science, Mary, are so used to turn to it upon all occasions, that it almost looks like losing one's wits altogether, to go on so, and take nothing." "People of no science, ma'am, do not require it." "Well now, so much the worse for them, but was not the point I came to talk to you about. Do you know, my dear, I am perfectly miserable in my mind about you. I can't sleep at nights for thinking about the impossibility of your living on, all by yourself, in this great palace of a house." Miss Brotherton turned away her head, and resting her elbow on the mass of cushions that were piled beside her on the sofa, concealed her eyes with her hand, while her neighbour proceeded to discuss her condition. "Did you ever hear of such a thing in your whole life, my dear?" "No, never. That's quite certain. It is quite out of the question, and impossible, and to speak out the whole truth of it, it is not in any way decent." Something a little approaching to a start produced a slight movement in Miss Brotherton. Miss Gabberly proceeded. "Well now, my dear, I have been thinking that what you must do is to find out among your friends and acquaintances some respectable person in situation of a gentlewoman to live with you. Somebody already known in the neighbourhood would be most desirable, because then you would not have the trouble of introducing her, for of course it will be no wise proper for so young a person as you to visit about, even in the country, without a proper chaperone." Again the cushions were slightly moved, but this time it was not a start but a shudder which caused it. "Well now, my dear Mary," resumed friendly Miss Gabberly, "what do you think about that?" "It requires a longer time than I have yet had before I can answer your question, Miss Gabberly," replied the young lady. "Well now, that's very true, and very discreet and sensible, and God forbid, my dear, that I should make you do anything in a hurry. Only you must not forget that everybody will be on the lookout to observe what you do. Depend upon it, that they won't wait to make their remarks, that's all." The heiress retained her meditative position, but said nothing. "Don't you think what I have said is true, my dear?" Mary bowed her head, but without changing the position of the hand which concealed her face. "I wish she would look up at me," thought Miss Gabberly. "I might guess then, perhaps, if there was any chance for me." "It would be a comfort as well as a protection, wouldn't it, my dear, to have a kind, affectionate friend always near you?" Mary bowed again. "Well now, I wish you would open your dear heart and speak out. Tell me, don't you feel very lonesome when you sit down to dinner?" "I've been long used to that, Miss Gabberly." "Yes, but then you had not got to think all the time, as I am sure you must do now, that there was nobody near you, and that there was nobody in the whole great house but own self, besides the servants, that there was nobody to drink your health, nobody to say, 'Won't you take a little bit of more, my dear?' Nobody to say, 'That isn't this very nice?' Nobody to give you a nod and a smile when you look up, nobody to ask, 'Shall I peel an orange for you, dear?' Or, 'Shall I mix your strawberries and cream, my love?' Now isn't that all dismal?" "Very dismal, ma'am," replied the young lady in a voice that showed plainly enough that the picture was not an indifferent one. "Well now, that's saying something. I can't help thinking, dear Mary, I can't help saying that it has come into my head that if—" "Miss Gabberly," cried Miss Brotherton, starting up suddenly, "I must beg you now to leave. You have described my situation so forcibly that I feel more than ever the necessity of making some arrangement that may better it. But I will not do this without reflection. Leave me now. I thank you for your kind concern, and when you next call upon me, you shall find what you have said has not been disregarded." "Well now, that's all right. I'll go directly. Shall it be tomorrow, dear, that I call again?" "No, ma'am, if you please, not till next Saturday." "Saturday? Why, my dear, this is only Monday. It is a great while for me to live in such suspense about you, dearest." "No, ma'am, not very long. Saturday it must be, if you please, and I shall be happy if you will stay and dine here on that day." "Thank you, my dear. I shall like very, very much indeed. And then we can talk everything over, my dear. God bless you, my love. Take care of yourself, dearest, till Saturday, and just let me say one word in your ear at parting. Remember that it is nobody in the whole wide world that loves you as much as I do." Miss Brotherton submitted herself passively to the embrace which followed, and when the door closed after her affectionate neighbour, she stood, as it seemed, patiently, while her sharp, short, retreating footsteps were heard along the spacious corridor, and when they were heard no more, she applied her hand to the bell, but something made her pause ere she rang it, and stepping to a window that opened upon a balcony filled with skilfully shaded exotics, she peeped forth among them, till the active moving little figure of Miss Gabberly trudged along the drive below, became visible, and then the heiress turned again to the bell rope and pulled it vigorously. "Tell nurse Tremlett, tell Miss Tremlett to be so kind as to come to me immediately," was the order given to the servant who answered it. After the interval of a few minutes, during which Miss Brotherton stood with her arms resting on the mantelpiece with a countenance and attitude of deep meditation, the door opened again, and a pale, thin, little old woman entered, who, had not her wrinkles and grey locks betrayed her, might have passed for 25, so active and nicely moulded was her little person. But despite her still clear and bright black eyes, her face showed that she could not be honestly count less than twice that sum of years. "Come in, dear nurse," said Miss Brotherton kindly. "Come in and sit down by me." The old woman obeyed this command without further ceremony, and, by her manner of doing it, showed plainly that it was not an uncommon one. "What have you been about, my child?" said she. "You don't look well." "I dare say not," replied Mary abruptly. "I have been bored and plagued, Nurse Tremlett, and now I am going to bore and plague you, in order to comfort myself." For all answer, the chartered nurse put her arm round the young lady's neck, and gave her a loving kiss. "Nay, it is very true, Miss Tremlett, and no joke in it. I do assure you, I am going to make a terrible change in your manner of life, my dear old woman. I am going to make a state prisoner of you." "You may plague and puzzle your old nurse as much as you like, my darling, but you will but smile and look a little less dismal than you have done of late. What is it you are going to do to me, Miss Mary? I dare say it is nothing that I shall think very hard." "I don't know that, Miss Tremlett," replied Miss Brotherington, very gravely. "Miss Tremlett, Miss Tremlett and Miss Tremlett," said the old woman, looking earnestly at her. "What does that mean, Miss Mary? I don't like it." "I don't know. I know you won't like it, but I must bear you. But you must bear that, and a great deal more, my dear old friend. You must make up your mind to lead a new life altogether, and I'm very afraid that you will not like the changes." "Oh, goodness, Miss Mary, what is it you mean? Are you going to send me away from you? Are you?" "Is that the worst thing I could do to vex you?" said the young lady, very cordially returning the caress she had received. "You need not be afraid of that, at any rate. The misfortune I threaten is of quite a different kind." "Well, then, I shan't mind it. Let it be what it will. But I don't think it is anything very bad, my dear, for you look as if you were ready to laugh, though you try to look grave and talk of misfortune." "It will be of no misfortune to me, I assure you, but quite the contrary. I shall like it very much, and that is the reason you see me ready to smile, and if you will be a dear good woman, and make no difficulties about it, all will go well. Miss Gabberly has been here, Nurse Tremlett, and she tells me that I must immediately take some elderly lady into the house to sit with me and take care of me, because, as she says, I am too young to live alone, and all that neighbourhood will be making remarks upon me." "Well, my dear, I dare say she says no more than the truth. Your great fortune, your prettiness, all that will bring certain many a eye upon you, my dear, and, of course, it won't do for you to go on without having some steady lady of a companion, like, to be living with you." "But I hate all ladies, and would come to live as a companion. But I hate all ladies that would come to live as a companion, like," replied the young lady. "What would I do with a Miss Mogg trotting about after me to ask if I wanted my smelling bottle or my pug dog? That is not the worst that could happen to me either. As sure as you are there, Nurse Tremlett, Miss Gabberly has made up her mind to come and live with me as her companion herself." "And would you not like that, by your manner, dear? I do think she is rather too bustling and busy for you. You're such a reader that you would not like anyone who is over talkative and fidgety about you. But don't fret yourself for that, dear. You must make some civil sort of excuse to Miss Gabberly. You are clever enough to find one, I dare say." "Yes, Nurse Tremlett, I think I am. I have found one already." "That's very right, Miss Mary. And what shall you say to her, my dear?" "I shall tell her that you are going to live with me as my companion." "Nonsense, dear! That is a joke, is it, that you were looking so merry about?" "Miss Tremlett, I am not jesting in any way," replied Miss Brotherington very gravely, "and I entreat you to listen to my proposal as seriously as I make it. I'm friendless, very friendless, my dear nurse, and trust me, with all my money I am greatly to be pitied. Why, in addition to the misfortune of not having a relation in the world, should I be doomed to the misery of hiring a stranger to pester me with her presence from morning to night? It is a penance that I cannot and will not endure. Yet I know that all people will say that I ought not to sit up here alone to receive company, and I do not wish to be spoken of as a person who either knows not or values not propriety. But if you will do what I desire, Miss Tremlett, you may save me from this, and from what is I perhaps should unhappily consider as a greater misfortune still, namely the being forced to pass my life with a person whose presence was a pain to me." Tears flowed down the cheeks of the heiress as she spoke, and the devoted servant who sat beside her, although absolutely confounded by the strange proposal, could find no words to utter in opposition to it. "Dear nurse, you will not forsake me then?" said Mary, smiling through her tears. "There's a dear soul. You will let me have my own way in everything, about your dress, you know, and all that. It will be worth anything in the world to see Miss Gabberly when she first beholds you sitting up in state in the drawing-room." From the moment the old woman had perceived that her beloved but wilful darling was not only serious but sorrowful, that too concerning no imaginary grief, but from the contemplation of the truly melancholy isolation of her condition, all disposition to resist her vanished. And yet Nurse Tremlett was perfectly capable of perceiving all the inconveniences likely to arise on both sides from so strange a scheme. But even while such thoughts silently took possession of her, leaving perhaps some legible traces on her countenance, her young mistress looked so kindly and so coaxingly in her face, as if once reading and appreciating all she had to say, that she felt nothing was left her but obedience. "Do what you will with me, my dear," she said, with a fond smile and a shake of the head that seemed to say, "I know you must have your own way, Mary." And thus was conceived and established a mode of life for the pretty heiress, which left her as completely uncontrolled to all she did and all she said as if Nurse Tremlett were still occupied her quarters in what was once called the nursery, but had since become the favoured nurse's sitting room. Mary's delight in dressing and drilling the old woman for her new duties was childish and excessive, and most triumphant was the satisfaction with which she perceived that rich black silks and delicate white crape performing their office upon her nice little person so effectually as to give her quite as much the air of a gentlewoman as the majority of those who were likely to meet her. So, on the following Saturday, Miss Gabberly found Miss Brotherington no longer the solitary occupant of her elegant boudoir, but with a remarkably well-dressed elderly lady seated in the most luxurious of all newly invented chairs which decorated the apartment, with a small work-table before her, while on the footstool at her feet sat the heiress, looking a vastly deal more happy than she had ever been before. The mystification did not last long. The eyes of Miss Gabberly were that of a happy fabric, which enables the owner to retain for ever the memory of every face they have looked upon, and it was with heightened colour and no very sweet expression of countenance that she exclaimed, "So, you have taken your old nurse Tremlett to sit with you?" "My nurse no longer, but my most kind friend, Miss Gabberly, who has affectionately consented to forsake many of her former comforts, in order to be useful to me. You will perceive, ma'am, that your advice has not been lost upon me." "Well, now, this is a strange whim, Miss Brotherington, but of course you are not serious in trying to make me believe that this is your intention, to let Nurse Tremlett assist you in receiving your company. If it be so, I think it but fair to tell you at once, as my experience is rather greater than yours, that not one single soul among all our rich folks will care to visit you at all. I don't wish to affront you, Nurse Tremlett, but if you won't contradict what I say, I am sure of that." Miss Tremlett showed herself an apt scholar, for she bowed her head, went on with her knitting, and said nothing. She was silent, however. Miss Brotherington was not. "Listen to me, ma'am, if you please, for a few minutes, while I explain to you my ideas on the subject, and having done so, I desire that it may never be alluded to again. I am left, Miss Gabberly, as I dare say you know, exceedingly well in the possession of an ample fortune, with unlimited power to spend it as I please. Now I do not please to spend any part of it in putting myself under circumstances that I should feel annoying to me. For this reason I will not hire a gentlewoman, in all human probability of much higher birth than myself, to watch my caprices and endure my whims. If any one now in existence really loves me, it is Miss Tremlett, and I, too, most sincerely love her. Therefore I flatter myself that drawing tighter the tie that has long united us will occasion no pain neither. If the obscure tradition I have heard respecting my grandfather be correct, he received much kindness when travelling in the country as an itinerant tinker from Miss Tremlett's father, then a flourishing farmer in Yorkshire. So you perceive, Miss Gabberly, that I am really honoured by the association. But if any one should fancy the contrary, if any one should feel that the luxuries of my house and table, the only attractions I know of, by which I may hope to draw my neighbours round me, if any one should feel that the value of these are lessened by the presence of Miss Tremlett, they must give them up. For the price I shall put upon my good dinners and fine balls will be the most courteous and kind politeness to that dear and valued friend. And now that we have finally and forever dismissed this subject, will you tell me if I may hope for the pleasure of your company at dinner today, Miss Gabberly?" From this period Miss Tremlett never quitted Mary Brotherington, except when the heiress accommodated Lady Clarissa Shrimpton by the use of her carriage, when they were both going to visit at the same mansion, arrangement which had often taken place during the late Miss Brotherington's lifetime, and which was of such very obvious mutual convenience that one rarely invited without one was rarely invited without the other. Miss Brotherton by degrees recovered her natural high spirits, and though she not unfrequently felt the weight of great loneliness, she was rapidly learning to enjoy her independence. She read a great deal, though nobody knew anything about it. She dearly loved flowers, and was often assisted in their cultures with her own hands, despite her half-dozen gardeners. She laid out whole miles of gravel walks in her own grounds, with almost as much skill as went to form the Cretan labyrinth, in order that she might walk and walk and walk without passing her own lodge gates, and running the risk of being called imprudent. She still indulged herself, and with no sparing license, in caricaturing her neighbors, and, in all truth, it must be told, derived no small portion of amusement from the variety of modes she adopted to assure the most almost innumerable pretenders to her hand that it was not in her power to reward their valuable and flattering attachments. Such was Mary Brotherton's condition when she complied with Lady Clarissa's request to drive over to Dowling Lodge the day after they had dined there. Upon this occasion, as upon many previous ones, the young lady, for lack of other amusement, occupied herself in selecting subjects for her merry pencil. The best excuse to be offered by her offences in this line is, that nobody but Miss Tremlett ever saw her saucy productions, so that assuredly they gave pain to no one. And when the heart is empty and the head full, much allowances must be made for such freaks and fancies. While laying up stores of sketches from Sir Matthew, Lady Clarissa, and the poet, her eye suddenly became fixed upon the beautiful child who had been brought in for general examination. Like most other ready limners of the human face, Miss Brotherton had considerable skill in physiognomy, and ere long she had gazed on the pretty, nicely dressed little boy, she felt persuaded that in spite of his gay habit de fête, the child was ill at ease and under great discomfort.